Hello, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 6 of the ESG Experience, the podcast about all things ESG and beyond. Whether you're an ESG expert or just dipping your toes into the ESG universe, this podcast is for you. Together, we'll navigate the alphabet soup of ESG, share strategies, and discuss industry news and trends. I'm Helee Lev, CRO of ESG at Conservice.
And I'm Ryan Nelson, the CEO of ESG at Conservice.
Today, we are fortunate enough to be joined by William Burckart, CEO of the Investment Integration Project, TIIP for short. He does go by Bill, so don't call him William, to discuss creating and adopting investing strategies that are aimed at affecting systems-level change. Bill is the CEO of TIIP and is a co-founder of Colorful Capital, founded in 2022, right?
Mm-hmm.
2022.
Yep.
Want to hear more about that? He is a fellow of the High Meadows Institute, a regular columnist for NASDAQ.com, and is a co-author of the book 21st Century Investing, Redirecting Financial Strategies to Drive Systems Change. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Yeah, good to have you. And to clear the air, can we call you William or Bill, or are you like, I'm Bill? Because I wasn't sure if we swore William off or something. Or...
Wait, so I tell you what, if I say anything wrong or dumb, you can call me William. But if
you're in trouble.
Yeah.
What's your middle name? Does it have to go like?
Oh, the full name is William Edward Burckart III.
Edward.
Oh, the third.
Third. Oh,
yeah. Good. Yeah, I try to be, as you were mentioning earlier, Bill, we want to be conscientious of people's names and get them right. I try to not go to the short version. I was on a meeting earlier, I won't disclose, but this person's name was Joseph, and my colleague kept going, Joe. And I'm like, Joseph hasn't told us to call him Joe. So I'm sticking with Joseph, and he was responding, and they're going Joe, and I'm kind of like, I try and respect that anyhow.
Wait, William Edward Burckart III. Is that like a lot of pressure to be the third?
I just think it's a reflection of how not creative my family was when it came to naming, because this is like two different threads of Williams on one side of my family. So yeah, it was just a lack of creativity. Honestly, that's what it was.
Well, maybe all that creativity was saved for your brain and all of the things that you're working on, apparently, because there's some very cool things. I know you wrote a book. You are the CEO of a company. You co-founded another company, to say the least, just getting to know you quickly over a couple hours of research this morning. But there's a really cool concept I've gathered that we're excited to hear about and learn about a little bit today. I wanted to start with this interesting quote here. I kind of picked on a little bit ago, but this is an ESG podcast, as we call it. But I think the co-writer and maybe co-founder of TIIP said this: as investor appetite for ESG data and sustainable investments has grown, ESG has fallen short in addressing systemic issues such as inequality and climate change. So in 2015, you and this person, I think Steve Lindenberg, is that right?
Steve Lindenberg, yep.
Steve Lindenberg, yeah, started the Investment Integration Project, known as TIIP, to encourage what you're calling system-level investing, which is really cool. Did you make up system-level investing? Is that a term you guys coined? Was that a thing? Tell us what we can do better as ESG folks, where we're falling short, and why we need to be thinking about, or what system level investing is.
Yeah, sure. So the whole concept of system level investing, it came about basically through shared frustration. So I came at this from the perspective of a kind of impact investment specialist who had been working with various foundations, and to some extent some mutual fund companies, where essentially helping them kind of integrate impact and investment objectives. And very much though, prior to when I started working with mutual fund companies, very much private market focused. Steve, on the other hand, is one of the godfathers of the whole sustainable investment, really ESG integration generally. He's like the L of KLD. He co-founded Domini Impact Investments and the Harvard Edition. So he's done all the things, right? And Steve was at it from the perspective of like public markets and what we were actually achieving via ESG integration. And we both had that kind of shared like frustration and understanding of like, are we actually accomplishing anything? Like we're telling really good stories about our portfolios and particular funds, but like just because this fund is avoiding more carbon emissions via its holdings, or it's creating more jobs and economic opportunity, is it actually making a dent in the kind of fundamental problems of these bigger overarching system of climate or inequality, things like that? And so that was really where we came together. And so I would say we noticed developments by different investors who were starting to reflect this kind of thinking. We put a name on it for sure. So we can take credit for that. And then we did a lot of work around kind of building up basic concepts and the theory behind it all, as well as baseline evidence on who's doing what.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's very interesting, just to kind of continue on that path. You talk about showing how system level investors support and enhance the health and stability of the social, environmental, and the financial systems on which they depend for long-term returns. So I'm gathering the concept is if we're not paying attention to these systems, they are part of what we're doing anyhow, and we're like hurting ourselves if we're not paying attention. The financial societal systems and financial systems aren't going to function anyhow. So perhaps we should focus a little bit more on the system as we go. So it's really cool, big thinking.
Yeah, well, and if you look at right around the same time that the book that Steve and I did, when that was published, so this was like April of 2021, another book was published at the same time called Moving Beyond Modern Portfolio Theory. And it was written by John McCormick and James Helee. And their book, so if you think of these as companion books, our book really gets into the how of system level investing. John and Jim's book really gets into the why. And so a lot of kind of, and full disclosure, John was one of the earliest supporters of TIIP. Like he funded a lot of our stuff. And so it was a lot of like, we were all kind of trading off each other's ideas. But part of what John and Jim kind of put a really nice like fine point on, which is this idea of saying, look, as investors, like think big institutional investors that kind of have the majority of the capital, right? They have these long-term time horizons. So if you're GPIF, the biggest pension fund in the world in Japan, your time horizon, they're not just like, they don't think of themselves as a long-term investor. They think of themselves as a super long-term investor. So their time horizon is 100 years. They got to pay out beneficiaries 100 years from now. Mm-hmm. And so their whole thing is, what John and Jim kind of pointed out was like, look, any kind of deviation in returns that most investors kind of generate has less to do with individual stock picking as it does with the overall health of the economy. And so their whole thing was where most people sit is around seeking alpha. But in reality, particularly if you're a long-term investor, you have to be thinking about building beta. So building the kind of health of the economy. Because that will be the ultimate kind of influencer of your performance long term. And so once you acknowledge that, and then if you also acknowledge the fact that there are things that we would consider our portfolio risks, you can also acknowledge that, well, there's things that are considered systemic and they're often considered exogenous and it's this interesting, weird conundrum with the investment community where we think, well, we can be impacted by these big systemic issues, but we as an investment community can't do anything about them. Mm-hmm. And there are feedback loops in between the two. And so that was where Steve and I were trying to get to, was to say, like, look, there's a lot from the discipline of systems dynamics that could be usefully kind of brought into how we think about investment. And so then it becomes less about what are these ESG characteristics that might ultimately be material to the performance of any one of my holdings, to really starting to think about, well, if we're going to grapple with these big systemic problems, we need a different kind of tool set beyond just, doing filters or doing screens for certain criteria.
Sure.
So if I'm to recap a little bit, perhaps in layman's terms, so people they've been doing investments for years, right? And then in the last, say, decade, people have gotten hyper-focused on ESG related investments or impact investments, but they're piecemealed, right? So I could do really well with this portfolio company in this area and really well with this portfolio company in this area, but no one's really bringing it all together and no one's looking at the macro level factors that could impact even the best portfolio company or the best fund with the best intentions. Is that fair?
That's super fair. Yeah, because it comes back to that idea. And it's not to say that it's because investors just intentionally don't want the information or they don't want to act in a certain way, they're not incentivized to do it.
Yeah.
The data infrastructure, the regulatory environment, like things just, the context wasn't right for a
They
lot
don't
of
even have the purview, like my purview is my fund or my purview is this, you know, like it's
Right.
not necessarily for me to know, but to your point, everyone's impacted by the macro level factors, so they should care. So that's where I would kind of ask, like, tell us more about the how, right? Because you're talking about corralling a lot of money, a lot of capital, a lot of powerful people, a lot of people that don't probably like to be told what to do. Is this like a voluntary coalition, or how do you, how? I just like how in all caps with a big question mark. How do you do
Yeah,
it?
so it's actually great. So when we first started, so we like name it, here's the basic concept, and we ask people like, are we crazy or should we go further? And people encourage us, the right kinds of stakeholders essentially encourage us to go further. And so what we did was we said, okay, let's actually look at the activities of a range of investors, asset owners and asset managers, big and small, in the US, around the world, to really start to understand when this kind of thinking manifests, how does it manifest? And to get to your point, so we could start to guide people on how to do it. And what we found were a couple of things. One, when you're trying to understand if an investor is engaging in some variation of system level investing, you're essentially looking at a couple of on-ramps. And we used to use this metaphor where it's like there's the system level investment highway, and there's a couple of on-ramps onto that highway, as hokey as that sounds.
Yeah,
ESG
no, that
integration,
makes sense.
right? But it's helpful, right? People love visuals. So ESG integration one, impact investment, long-term value creation, universal ownership, like all these things you've all heard, right? But like those are kind of telltale signs that maybe there's something that's happening at a systemic level, because you kind of have to make these intentional decisions to go that route. So once they get onto the system level, essentially how people put this into practice is in fundamentally two different ways. So one is they look at their conventional investment techniques, and so they start saying, what is reflected in my investment policy statement or investment belief statement? Do we actually make a commitment to some kind of systemic goal? Do we acknowledge our role in broader capital markets in the economy? So you're kind of looking for things like that. You're looking at security selection and portfolio construction. Are they integrating ESG characteristics? Are they trying to seek impact in some of these portfolios? And are they doing so in a way that's maybe identifying industries or markets of the future? And so something, if you're thinking of climate change, you might say, well, yeah, it could just be we're going to put money into a climate focused fund. But what if that climate focused fund also kind of had circular economy kind of thinking embedded into its design? So everything that the companies that they're investing in are ultimately looking for products primarily that are regenerative by design. So they're not losing their value as they're recycled or their components are torn apart in different ways. So it's things like that where you're looking for that conventional, and then you're looking at shareholder engagement. Are they doing things that go beyond just by company engagement to really start thinking about engaging entire sectors and value chains, engaging managers, engaging policymakers? So really starting to take a more holistic view of what that kind of stewardship could look like. Once they do those conventional things, they then get into what we call these kind of advanced techniques. And these advanced techniques are kind of have a systems focused embedded in them. So if you take like a concept like, you probably heard of additionality. So it's like, but for this investment, or is this investment contributing something new that's ultimately creating a more resilient system? So that's systems thinking. And so you see that reflected in like Bridges Funds Management, kind of one of the leading impact investment managers. They do a lot of investments in skills-based training, companies that focus on skills-based training. Part of the reason they did that was because after the financial crisis, one of the things that hampered the UK, so they started in the UK, they now have a US base, but in the UK, one of the things that hampered their development coming off the recession was a lack of skills for industries of the future jobs. So they invested a lot into that as a way to combat that. Or another one like the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund, they literally started post-financial crisis, and really their whole thing was to say, what are those pockets of the economy that are important but are underinvested in, and that we as the strategic investment fund can start to shore up to create an ultimately a more dynamic and adaptable system. So they're looking for those kinds of things, both in terms of how to reflect that in those conventional kind of policies and practices and programs, but then going well beyond it with like this broader tool set.
Which it makes sense that it can be difficult to have that point of view if you are not thinking about, if you don't have 100-year plus hold times or whatever you want to call it. I can see now, I can see also that that a mind shift and things can happen and people can see even more short-sighted, that maybe it's still helpful to have a healthy economy and that we actually can influence it in a healthy society and a healthy planet, and we can influence it. But yeah, it's nice that those longer hold terms make it clearer to see that that they're into it. But I wanted to say the something that struck me in one of your visuals. There are some great visuals. I don't know what I was looking. I think I just downloaded a PDF. I didn't read the book in full transparency. But uncoordinated innovation. I don't know if that was one of the failures or the first path, but it reminds me of a term that Helee uses a lot: the random acts of ESG. And we go somewhere and it's like, okay, these things are happening within your organization or with one of our customers, but what's the story? Is it meaningful? I kind of connected that with uncoordinated innovation. Are you putting, is it investment by investment, or is there some coordination to actually building something? Is that roughly what was meant by that?
So kind of, sort of. I mean, really what was meant there, and we were borrowing from when the impact investment term and concept was starting to get promulgated. One of the things, Monitor Institute had a big report, and the report essentially was saying there are these phases of industry development, and where the impact investment space was, think 2008, 2009, right around that time, where it was uncoordinated innovation. You had a bunch of investors that were doing interesting things that suggested that there was this kind of new practice emerging, but no one had really sat down and drawn an analytical circle around it to basically say okay, here's what's happening. Here's what we can start to consider our best practices. And then the kind of emergence of industry associations, credentialing, evidence-based, data provider, all of the things. So absent that, we're still in this kind of uncoordinated innovation. And when we were starting to kind of peg where we were as an industry, that was just a useful, helpful frame for people to kind of understand that that's where we are. And, when TIIP started, it was 2015, and there weren't, I always say the intersection for system level investing, to just confuse the metaphor even further, was not very crowded. And that in the span of 8 years, it's gotten way more crowded. So it's not just that there are more investors that are starting to experiment with this, but that you have more efforts and initiatives like pre-distribution initiative, the shareholder commons, preventable surprises. You go down the list of folks that are attempting to help to build this ecosystem, so that there is a kind of gold standard of practice that starts to emerge, and that more investors ultimately can start to do it.
Got it.
So I have a two-part question for you. So the concepts make sense. Say that I'm an institutional investor, a pension fund, and I agree, and I say, what do I do? What do I tactically, literally do next? Or maybe, the flip side of that is, what are examples that pension funds or institutional investors are doing now? So where is the on-ramp on the highway for someone who's just getting going? But maybe illustrative, literal examples.
Yeah. So I think, stepping back for a second, so it is one of those things that it depends on the type of investor you are and kind of where you are in your own kind of gestation of embracing some of those on-ramps versus just going full stop. So a good example would be something full transparency, they're a client of mine, so University Pension Plan, jointly sponsored pension plan in Canada. They were started about 2 years ago or so. And really, new pension plan, they wanted to have systems focus embedded in their entire design. And so they started with, as many pensions do, they start with the kind of governance play. So with most pensions, they have to start with their kind of basic policies and programs that guide their investment decision making. And so for them, it was really about, do we even have a shared vision amongst not just the C-suite and the kind of senior leadership that's focused on this, but also our trustees? They need to have the full backing of all of that for a pension to ultimately move in this direction. So we worked in partnership with a gentleman named John McCormick, who wrote the other book. We took them through a process to essentially develop investment beliefs around kind of how they saw their capital, both generally and the role that they wanted it to play in the economy and society and the things that they needed to control for, but really kind of baking into it this idea that they understood that to get to what they wanted to do, which was to really start to actually solve climate change, they would need to bring other investors along with them. They need to bring the rest of the industries along with them. So for them, it was about not just saying, we're going to, invest in a way that is aligned with climate solutions and things like that, but we're going to do so in a way that we know we're bringing these other investors along. And so a really good illustration of that is something like, you guys have heard of Climate Action 100 Plus.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, biggest investors, they're systematically targeting the biggest carbon emitting companies in the world. And that's great because they're using their collective clout to do that. And it's increasing their ability to be effective at shareholder engagement. Here's the problem. In Canada in particular, great. So one of the logical recommendations could be, you guys should join Climate Action 100 Plus, bring your voice into that. Except that with their focus being obviously Canada primarily as a jointly sponsored pension plan, none of the companies that Climate Action 100 Plus, no Canadian companies reached the threshold to make it in front of Climate Action 100 Plus. So what UPP had to do was to say, but we still see the virtue in that strategy. So they literally created a version of Climate Action 100 Plus, but for Canada.
Oh, wow.
So that's a really good example of when you have an investor that's saying, I am aligning my investment decision-making with this idea of climate solutions, but I also appreciate that I may be this massive investor, but I alone can't solve this issue. So I've got to bring other investors along with me. That's like a really good example. You have others that are like where dominant impact investments, yet again, another client where they are focused on forest and deforestation. That's this unique lever that they see being able to pull and influence that's ultimately going to affect climate change. So they've done a lot of work mobilizing other investors, aligning their investment decision making with that kind of focus, and then starting to build up a lot of the kind of knowledge and resource base for other investors to do the same, to kind of understand forest and deforestation in an investment decision useful way. So that's like another example, right? So you have a lot of these where ultimately, and this gets into the definition of system level investing, where it's to say you are still doing the things, you're integrating ESG characteristics, you are seeking impact, you're doing all the things with your security selection and portfolio construction. But you're also looking to build kind of the knowledge base for other investors to do the same. You're building collaborative platforms so that you can actually coordinate, that you can actually engage in collective action. And you're also thinking about, well, what does that regulatory environment look like? So that it's, taking the heebie-jeebies out of doing this from investors, but also kind of paving the way to incentivize it or reward investors for actually doing this sort of thing.
So let me see if we can get to the bottom of this. This is kind of a common thread I've been having in these discussions, and I feel like you're helping us get closer to the answer, or maybe you actually know the answer. Does someone actually believe we can solve the climate challenges, and or can you solve inequality, for example? And the question is, who believes this and is working on it? And for us in our world, we've got management companies and organizations who have to do certain things. They have to report certain things. So sometimes they don't want to, and they don't believe in it, and they think it's dumb. Okay, not any of our customers, let's say, but maybe some people, right? But then we say, well, the investors are requiring it. So the investors are requiring it. So you're working with the groups that are telling people that if you're money to work, I want this information because I want to make sure this is happening. But so everyone fears the investor. The investors are saying, do it. So I'm like, great. Investors are making people make responsible decisions with their capital and execute on it and demonstrate. But why are the investors doing it? So now are we saying the investors are actually doing it because they know that long-term it'll be an issue? Or is it the consumers whose retirement money it is that actually want it, or what, who actually, okay, and I don't know the answer. I'm just curious your thoughts, and like, is it group think that we're actually trying to solve the problem, or is it a couple good people, or is it truly investors that are the smartest people in the world that know we have to solve this, or like?
Yeah, all good questions. So I think it's a little bit of like yes and yes. So in the sense that you have a number of investors who, particularly if they have a long-term time horizon in terms of obligations, they are better seeing the connection between when these systems break down and the shocks and instability that it creates for their long-term performance. So there is a particular motivation for them when they have these long-term obligations to say, oh, I need to actually take that seriously. At the same time, and I know this gets like repeated over and over again, but it's actually true in the sense that changing demographics, right? So the folks that are now controlling increasingly a lot of the wealth that's out there are younger generations that are predisposed to wanting to see their values reflected in their consumption and their investing and their purchasing. And then you have, just like all the data, it's like millennials, women, it's the stale, pale male. The old white guys are the problem, right? And so, and as they, yeah, Helee knows. And that's, and it's one of those
I do, but I just like how you call them the stale, pale male. I just usually call them the boring old white men, but the stale, pale male might be something that sticks with me.
I'm sure it is.
I sure hope it does. Yeah. Next time we do this, you'll have the sign in the background that's that, as much as he's quoting Beyonce in the back. So there's that, and I'm like losing my train of thought because you asked a different layer to the.
Go ahead.
And then, so it's not that investors think that and most of them start from a downside risk mitigation perspective. So we talk about system level investing. What we found that resonates the most is like, do you believe that there is a difference between a portfolio risk and a systemic risk? Most of them will say yes. And then you say, okay, then if that's true, then do you agree that that our current modern portfolio theory tools aren't up to task for managing those big systemic risks? That's their lens, manage systemic risks. Once you get them understanding that, then you can get them into, but this is also about opportunity generation and thinking along those lines. They're not confusing, at least a lot of investors we work with, the bigger, institutional investors. They're not thinking that they are going to be the ones, that they should be the ones that solve these problems. The growing acknowledgement is that they contribute to the problems, and that when they contribute to those problems, it starts to, yet again, hamper long-term performance. And so it's something as simple as like, we've done a lot of work on income inequality as a systemic risk. And one of the things that we found in that was to say, like, look, you as institutional investors, because of, neoliberal thought, which has failed, it doesn't, the trickle down, all of the things, right? It doesn't work. And modern portfolio theory was really developed for short-term gains. And so you have this kind of disconnect with like, okay, we know that there's this big systemic issue. We know it needs to be better. And now they're saying, and we know where we're contributing. And so they're contributing in things like they're rewarding companies for, tax avoidance and tax deferment, right? And so you see a lot of that happening, which then starves those local economies where those companies operate from the resources that would ultimately then create a stable operating environment. So that's a problem. Things around labor and workers' rights and entire value chains. And it's like, if you have an entire workforce that is basically precariously placed because none of them have benefits and they're all, essentially one cold away from being destitute and short of like modern, slave labor in certain countries. It's like all of those things are part of how they contribute to income inequality. And then finally, executive compensation, where it's like when all of the upside and the way that these companies are run is really towards creating these big benefits to the actual CEOs or the executive leadership, as opposed to being distributed a little bit more evenly across this. Like there's all those statistics where it's like most people think that the highest paid executives get paid like 50 times more than the lowest paid employee. And in reality,
not 350.
Right. And so in that fairness thing, that balance quality is an actual thing. So those are some of those ways that institutional investors are kind of now starting to wake up to the fact that like, oh, when we do this, it actually degrades the system and actually narrows the world of investable opportunities that we have to play with.
So almost they're literally saying, so if I create so much, if everyone's poor, no one's gonna be able to buy my crap. So I better find a way to not make everyone so poor if I want this to work out long term.
And if I want the company that I'm investing in that's operating in country A to actually have like, I don't know, the rule of law around them and legal discourse and things like that, and customers that can actually pay for whatever it is that this company
participate.
Yeah.
So you've given up on finding a heart inside there. You're trying to translate it into money, dollars and cents as usual. To find the motivation. So you seem properly fired up. The stale, pale male, is that what fired you up to get Colorful Capital going? And I'm surprised you only founded it last year. It seems like such a great idea and something that someone like you might have thought of, I don't know.
Well, what's interesting. So Megan Kashner is my co-founder on it. And it's funny how it came about. Like, we've both been in the kind of impact investment and sustainable finance space for years. And obviously with like the systemic lens. And then somewhere along the way, we were connected. And we had this like conversation. We'd both been doing, as a gay man and she's a lesbian, and kind of we've been doing a lot of informal community building amongst our community, the LGBTQ plus community in the impact investment space. And we finally were connected. It was just happenstance how we got connected. And it went from like, oh, we should do like more like, I don't know, Zoom cocktail hours and things like that, right? It was the dead of the pandemic. And then when we started to really realize like, well, who would we invite to such a thing? And then you start to realize that there's a tremendous amount of access to capital, expertise, and just opportunity as part of this kind of constellation of folks that we have access to. And then we were like, well, let's look at our community more concretely. In particular, let's look at the inequality amongst our community, which disproportionately affects different segments of it more than others. And really started to think through, and we did all this research on it to kind of understand what was out there to better kind of diagnose where the potential opportunities might be to help support it. And what came back very clearly was that there was this gap. And there was this gap in terms of the early stage capital that would be available to LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs and founders. And so that was when we started to step back and we were thinking about it. And we're like, there's a real opportunity here. And we could create a kind of investment strategy that really intervenes at some of those pain points that all these entrepreneurs are talking about. And that there's a real unmet need. And it becomes even more acute the moment you add intersectionality into it. So you're not just transgender person, you're a transgender person that's also Black, right? And that your world of opportunity and the barriers that you're going to face just exponentially increases. And so that's where, and so what that does is also creates an opportunity to say, these are individuals that are systematically overlooked and undervalued. And so what happens if they weren't? And what kind of opportunities could get created, both from an investment perspective, but also for the communities that these founders and their promising enterprises are a part of. And so that was really the impetus for Colorful Capital.
It's awesome. So the investment strategy is obviously the certain population that's been, overlooked or has been deprived of capital before for no reason other than who they are, how they identify. And then do you have requirements also around the LPs in the fund, or you'll take anyone's money and reallocate it to where it should go?
Well, within reason, there are certain, sectors that we would never invest in, right? But so we very much, as impact investors and sustainable investors at our heart, like there are certain things that we just won't consider. But yeah, from a, we're trying to keep an open mind about, not limit ourselves too much, but also have some real kind of guardrails in place for the kind of capital.
No, it's good to see. And I hope it's like the beginning of a trend. We ran into a investment group out of Minneapolis that's similar. It's just not the typical face of, the institutional capital that you've known to see and associate with. And they're doing, something similar. But I hope to just keep seeing more. Because like you said, and good ideas are going to come out of there, right? Like different ideas, different perspective. The same reason you talk about DE&I in the first place is like, you're going to get the same group think, the same stale opinion, the same, point of view, the same types of businesses that cater to the same types of people. There's a lot of, I think dry powder in that area. So I think you'll do well financially as well as just, feeling like it's the right thing, the altruistic nature of the fund. So that's awesome. Your mailing, or I want to join like your mailing list. I want to hear what you guys are up to.
I would love it. There's a link for swag on the website, or you can get your own.
All right.
Sweatshirt.
I want.
but it's also, we're entering into this at the same time that there's other really great, there's a group called Start Out, which is this association that connects LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs and investors. There's angel stage investors like Chasing Rainbows and Pride Fund, and there's Angels, has had a historic focus on that's broader now. But the idea is that there are folks that have been doing some really incredible work for a number of years, and we get to join with that kind of, and help amplify that voice and hopefully contribute our own unique influence and impact into it.
It might be working, Bill. Let me tell you a story. So Helee and I have been in VC world, PE world, and in startup world for quite some time. We know the typical board makeup, typical founder makeup, right? We know what it is. Just recently, I'll say it like this, Helee and I were kind of, in a way, competing for a board position, and I'm going to get it, probably the lesser candidate, because they have no men on this board, and they need some diversity.
Oh boy. Oh boy.
Can you believe that's happening?
That is still like the exception, not the rule.
It is
Yeah.
absolutely the exception. There's a lot of work to be done. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying, can you imagine if those experiences start happening?
I mean, yeah, look, we have to acknowledge, okay, so we have to make room for the fact that at some point, the pale stale male will be, part
He'll
of
be back.
Maybe it'll become a
He's
historical.
gonna come back, Ryan says.
Maybe. I mean, maybe that's the world that we'll eventually live in. And you know what? Let's get there. If they become a historically marginalized population, great. We can solve that too.
No, I agree. Yeah, it's going to be a good journey. Well, that's really, really, really cool. Colorful Capital and TIIP. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing and being a thought leader and inventing stuff out of there. And I think, like the title of the book, defining 21st century investing, how it can be different and awesome. And that's brilliant. But that brings me, Bill, to a very important thing. I want to stop doing this, but our listeners, there would be an uprising. So we have to play this game. It's real quick. All you have to do is guess. I'm going to tell you a little context afterwards. Well, actually before, for the first time ever, I'm going to give you a little context before. But it's called Beans or Barley. I rename it every time too, but it's called Beans or Barley, which is the core product of this mission-based craft thing that I'm going to tell you. I'm just going to give you the name and where they're from, and you just have to tell me if it's coffee or beer or beans or barley. That's the name of the game, so try and say those words. It's called TIIP Brewing Company in Queen Anne's County, Maryland.
Barley?
That's right, Barley. It's owned and operated by a team of women veterans and first responders. They are dedicated to providing a harassment-free experience. And I actually, in the name of some of our in Colorful Capital and things, I actually discovered them on a list of LGBTQIA plus owned breweries and cideries in the U.S. If you want to follow the list, there's a list, and you kind of go around the U.S. and find all the ally or friendly craft breweries. So I don't know.
That's
I know
awesome.
you
Sounds
were in
like a
Baltimore
road trip
for a
to
while.
me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be quite the road trip.
I used to live in Baltimore too. I wish I had known. I would have spun on by. There you go.
Yeah, I checked it out because you went to the Johns Hopkins, right? And it's funny, if you wanted to get there from Baltimore, it's a 60-mile drive, but you cross the water. I don't know the area that 60-mile drive. If you wanted to walk, it's 166 miles. You can't walk across that bridge. You have to go way north and go somewhere to get over to like almost to Delaware. You know what I'm talking about?
Or you get in a tube with your friends and you do a little booze tubing trip and
Across
just
the water?
float on to. Yeah, there's a point where it's like Virginia, Maryland, and I forget what the third state is, but they all kind of
Delaware?
Yeah, it would have been. I guess it would have been Delaware,
Is
but
it?
they all kind of. It's Gunpowder Falls, I think, is like where they all
Cool.
come together. Yeah, but you booze tube down it. I haven't done that since grad school, but I remember it being enjoyable.
Well, yeah, no, that sounds fun, and congratulations on getting it correct, TIIP. And again, really appreciate your time today and the cool things you're doing, and hopefully we can connect again.
Yeah, this was a real treat. So thank you guys for having me on.
I appreciate it. Let us know if your travels take you to I'm in Chicago or Florida. I suppose you two could meet up in Florida if you really wanted to.
Well, yeah, but also Megan, my partner on Colorful, she's based in Chicago, so I actually
perfect.
Yeah,
introduce me. I'm always happy to leave my bedroom every now and again and have 3-dimensional meetings. So
she's a professor at Kellogg, right?
She's also a professor.
Oh, is she? That's perfect. It's my alma mater.
Oh yeah,
we'd love to meet up with her.
Yeah, and she's like the guru of impact investing there. She runs the Morgan Stanley Challenge. And
cool.
All the things, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll follow up with you. But no need for the hundreds of thousands of listeners to hear those details. So thank you all for joining. This has been another episode of the ESG Experience podcast. We appreciate you listening. If you enjoyed your time with us, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast directory. There's a new episode every month. And we appreciate our loyal subscribers for continuing to support our podcast. And if you do want to continue the conversation between episodes, follow us on your favorite social media channel and hashtag ESG Experience.